The real focus is how do you do effective advocacy in a way that will make a difference with key audiences.
Welcome. In this course, you'll learn how to make your advocacy effective. Effective advocacy is a necessary skill for leaders and staff members from civil society to non-governmental organizations. Instructors Rakesh Rajani and Ruth Levine will teach you how to move forward when the only solution involves persuading those around you. What do you do when you need to convince other people to change their behavior or their actions? Listen in to find out.
I'm Rakesh Rajani.
And I'm Ruth Levine.
And in this course, we will work with you to figure out how to do effective advocacy.
We're the instructors for this course, and we're absolutely delighted to have you join and participate in what we're expecting will be a stimulating and informative set of discussions.
Imagine that you live in a small city. For years, the water supply has been unreliable, and a group of people have formed an organization to solve this problem. They have collected information about the reliability of the water supply, how much it costs, and they've also documented the many times that the local and national officials have promised to improve water access. But now they have to figure out, what do they do next? How are they going to get to the decision makers? How are they going to change their minds and their actions so that the water problem is solved? Have you or your organization been in a similar challenge?
So who really uses advocacy, and what forms can it take?
When we say non-governmental organization, civil society organization, or NGO, we're talking about many, many different kinds and sizes of groups. For example, an NGO might be an environmental organization that's trying to get local community members to plant trees, or a parent-teacher organization that's trying to bring parents together to make school improvements. It might be a workers' collective that's trying to place pressure on employers to respect worker rights, or a group of people who are trying to get the government to spend more money on key child health services.
And when we talk about advocacy, we also are referring to a range of activities and tactics. While some organizations may advocate through direct outreach to fellow citizens in kind of one-on-one or small group discussions, others might take a different approach. They might seek coverage of their cause through media, newspaper, radio, television journalists. Advocacy can be highly visible. For example, you'll see large-scale campaigns with big billboards, huge TV adverts, and rallies. Or it can be something much quieter, behind the scenes, conversations with key decision makers and who influence them. In fact, as you'll see in our example later, almost everything that an NGO does, other than the direct provision of services, ends up needing some kind of advocacy in order to persuade others who are in important positions to think or behave or act in other ways that they would not on their own without your intervention.
All of this will be broken down into 6 sessions. The first session will explore how you can use this course to make yourself and your colleagues as successful as possible. Ruth and Rakesh will dive into the political and social context that advocacy takes place in. This session will introduce a real example that an NGO might work on. This example will be used repeatedly throughout the rest of the course. Finally, they'll teach you how to identify a need for advocacy and how to build what's called the theory of change, starting with your aims and working backwards to the steps you'll need to take to reach those goals. At the end of this session, your assignment will be to apply the guidelines of the theory of change to create a clear organizational problem statement. Throughout the session, please refer to the Theory of Change visual on the course website.
Before we get started, perhaps you want to know who we are and what is the experience we bring in advocacy. So let me start with myself. I'm a Tanzanian, and I've done most of my work in East Africa. I've worked at 3 different NGOs to advance children's rights, to improve access and quality of basic education, and to help make governments more open and accountable to their citizens.
At every organization Rakesh was a part of, advocacy was a key part of their strategy.
We help people and their organizations get better informed, better motivated, and better organized to help and pressure governments make better decisions, and then implement those decisions. Some of the work we did was kind of loud and public. Some of what we did was quieter. Through this experience, we had many successes and some failures too. And over time, I hope I've learned to do better advocacy, and I hope to share some of those lessons. I can tell you it's often not easy, and there are no magic solutions. But there are ways to think about this that can help make advocacy more powerful.
I'm from the United States, and I've done less on-the-ground advocacy work. For most of my career, I've been involved in policy research to inform decisions by government officials. The advocacy tactics that I've used have mostly been trying to help get research into the hands of people who can use it in government. And what I've done is mostly behind-the-scenes work, building relationships with public officials, getting a sense of what the questions are that they need answers to, building the credibility to be seen as a useful source of information and knowledge for their decision-making. In that work, I have found ways to apply some public pressure so that the government officials actually use the best available evidence for their policymaking.
Ruth currently works to fund research and advocacy efforts.
I've seen a wide variety of ways that organizations both succeed and sometimes fail in their advocacy efforts. So I'm hoping to bring that knowledge to bear and to help you in your work.
So now that you know a little bit about Ruth and myself, we can get going on to the main topics for our first session.
We've called this first session, If Advocacy is the Answer, What's the Question? Because the important place to start is not by saying we need an advocacy strategy, but rather by defining the problem you're trying to solve. And the problem isn't we don't have an advocacy strategy. Rather, the types of problems we're talking about are at the heart of what an NGO's mission is. We're not going to take time to list every possible type of problem an NGO might be working on, but let's talk about some of the most common. One is behavior change. For example, some NGOs might be working to reduce the prevalence of smoking, drug abuse, school dropout, HIV infection, and a host of other ills that have at least some behavioral component. Second is improving public services. Some NGOs work to improve the access to and quality of services, health, schooling that are provided by local or national governments. Other NGOs might be working to safeguard common resources. What I mean by this is that some NGOs work to reduce air and water pollution or deforestation and other problems that come about when natural resources are used in ways that fail to balance the public good with the private interests. Some NGOs work on governance challenges. They focus on shortcomings in the way government institutions work. For instance, they might focus on rigged elections, bribery, and other kinds of corruption. Still, other NGOs might work on rights and opportunities. They might seek to protect the rights and advance the well-being of groups that historically have been marginalized, whether that's ethnic or religious minorities. They might work on gender issues. They might work on a range of topics that have to do with exclusion from political processes and economic opportunities.
Take a moment to think. How does your organization fit into these categories? If it doesn't, how would you categorize the problem your organization works on?
Most problems don't fall neatly into one category, and there are lots of important interactions. So, for example, if you think about the problem of HIV prevalence, that's partly about behaviors, about whether people are using condoms and having safe sex, but it's also about whether sex education is provided by the schools and condoms are available through government services. So that has to do with different policy decisions. And if you draw back from those immediate causes or determinants, you might see that the problems have to do with marginalization, restricted opportunities. So keep this in mind because we're going to come back to it when we work through the theory of change in a few minutes.
So Ruth, we also need to be very clear about the context because while these problems may be similar in different parts where we work, the context will make a huge difference in terms of what you do to solve that problem. Understanding of that context is crucial for us to orient ourselves in terms of which is the right advocacy approach to use. Each country or city or rural district, depending on where you work, has its own history, its own politics, its own power relations, and its own kind of distinct context. But in general, it's helpful to think about context in terms of three different categories: open, restrictive, and semi-open. So I'm going to start describing an open context. Now, in reality, fully open contexts are very rare, but it's useful to think about what an open context is. It's one where I think doing advocacy work is favorable. In an open context, government is characterized by a high degree of transparency. They are not hiding things. They are open around how much money they're getting, how they're spending the money, so budgets, expenditures. And it also is open to encouraging citizens, people to engage through elections for sure, but also ongoing ways of doing feedback on a day-to-day basis. We planning to spend this money? What do you think? This is how we did. Does that make sense? In an open context, a wide range of points of view can be expressed. We can agree, we can disagree openly and in public. You can do that in media, for example. You can be interviewed, you can write a letter to the editor, and you're not afraid of retribution. You're not afraid that you'll be beaten up because you're saying something that's critical or that disagrees with some important person. And in such an open context, NGOs are free to operate and do what they want to do. They can get funding, they can use it, they can express difference in opinions. And in fact, they are seen as a critical part of the checks and balances on power and government. A government in an open system openly welcomes NGOs to kind of hold it to account. Now, the truth is that in many countries of the world, you don't see this openness. Whether you're looking at the global south or the global north, things, in fact, are moving in the opposite direction. Things are becoming more closed. You are seeing reversals of progress. And so in most of the world, it's much harder than what I've just described. So let's look at what is a restrictive context. What does that look like? Well, obviously, it doesn't have the kind of openness that we just discussed. You may find that there's a kind of secretive central authority that can do things, often nasty things, and get away with it. Or that the resources that the government uses are really used to benefit few people rather than public as a whole. You may find that there are elections, but the elections are not always a level playing field. Not everyone has an equal chance. The systems don't have integrity. Or if you think of day-to-day stuff, such as how education and health and other services work, you might find that people have very little chance to actually give their opinion, to say whether things are working or not. And in fact, if they complain, that they will face the consequences. You may find that the media is not open, that there is censorship. And in fact, people talk in hushed tones because they are afraid that if they speak openly and speak critically, that something may happen to them. In this space, NGOs have a hard time operating because they have to be very careful about what they say and how they operate because there are many restrictions that they have to worry about. They might be closed down or their leaders might be summoned to the police and in some cases even imprisoned or beaten up. In such contexts, doing advocacy requires you to be very careful to weigh the consequences of what you might do. And finally, let's talk about the third context, which, as you can imagine, is between closed and open. And in fact, most countries fall in this category. What does a semi-open context look like? Well, this is one where you'll find some level of transparency. There's some level of openness. It often looks good on paper and in laws, but in practice it falls short. Governments may promise to release certain things, but in practice they don't, or it's not very meaningful. The quality of elections may also be a problem. There are elections, but it may not be a level playing field. Not everyone will be able to compete, and you can't always be sure that everyone's vote will count equally. Or take media. The government will have an ostensibly free press and free television and free newspapers, but in reality you might find that those newspapers can't say certain things and that they are often under pressure or are forced to close down if they are very critical. In this kind of context, NGOs have a hard time to operate because they need to constantly figure out, can we do this or can we not? What will be the implications of this action? Might we get in trouble if we speak the truth? May some of the people we are working with get arrested or get harassed or get locked up? And so in this context, NGOs can certainly operate, but they have to always be mindful of the laws and regulations, both written and unsaid, in order to be able to get their things done. Most of the places where we work are semi-open and have various restrictions. For NGOs, this means the advocacy needs to be done with care and consideration, particularly in two ways. The first is about the strategy. You really have to think, given the problem I'm working on in this place, what can I do in order to succeed? Just because something works somewhere else may not mean it can work in your context. So we'll get to think about that in a moment. The second question is a very practical one about self-preservation, about taking care of yourself and your people. You have to think, in this place in which I'm working, what risks does my advocacy work expose myself, my organization, and my colleagues to, and how can we mitigate for that? You'll be better placed to make those judgments rather than anyone else from the outside. And we'll talk more about this in the 6th session of this course. Before you start planning and doing advocacy, it's really important to be clear what is worth advocating for. In other words, what are you trying to achieve? This might sound simple, but it's actually harder than it seems. You might think, we know what we want, just tell me how to do it effectively. Believe me, we've often felt this way ourselves. But we have learned that sometimes the solutions we come up with are not that helpful or are not that clear.
So how would this look in a real scenario? Coming up now, Ruth and Rakesh will explore how this plays out in the education sector in East Africa.
We all know how important education is to parents and to societies, and how much money governments put into building schools, buying textbooks, and paying teachers particularly. But we might not all be aware of how hard it is to improve the quality of education. Rakesh, I know you've got lots of experience in this area, and so this is the example that we're going to carry through for the rest of the course. Why don't you give us a little bit of background about education policy and practice in East Africa over the past decade or so, and a sense of how non-governmental organizations have tried to accelerate progress?
Allow me to go a little further back. When countries like Kenya, Uganda, and Tanzania became independent in the 60s, the vast majority of children had no opportunity for schooling. Education was just meant to be for a small elite that was going to work in the colonial government. So you can understand why at independence, a huge focus of the newly independent governments was to democratize education, to make it education for all rather than just a few, and to make sure that all children got to at least complete primary school, got to be literate, read, write, and count. So policies were passed to expand education by building schools, enrolling kids, training new teachers. Education became a huge political priority and the most important pathway out of poverty through which people could get status and jobs and a better life. And the most important measure of success became enrollment. How many kids of school age were signed up to go to school? Over time, millions of children got into primary school. NGOs had to continue to fight to include those who would be left out, such as poor kids who could not afford school fees or kids who are living in far-flung, scattered rural communities. And after the economic downturns in the 1980s, NGOs had to fight for sufficient resources to go to education, to build classrooms, to buy desks, and to pay teachers. So in short, what happened over those decades was a familiar advocacy pattern. Number one, focus on getting kids enrolled for schooling. Number two, remove the cost barriers to schooling. And number three, make the case to government and for aid money to go towards education. Many of these efforts are really successful. In many countries, education took the largest share of the government budget. Teachers were the largest share of the government payroll. And enrollment numbers went from something like 5% at independence to over 90% in the 1990s.
Wow, 5% to 90% does sound like a pretty amazing success.
It was a huge success. However, keen observers started to notice some problems. Kids were enrolled in schools, but they were not learning. Even after many years in schools, too many children seemed to be unable to read and lack other basic skills.
So what was the response to that?
Well, there were really kind of two sets of responses. One, for example, from the then president of Tanzania, was to argue for sequencing. He basically said, first, we must get all children into school. And once that happens, we can then focus on quality. The problem with this approach was that many pupils and parents were voting with their feet, meaning they were in school, but noting that school was not very useful, many of them started skipping school on some days or just dropping out altogether. The other response, common among many NGOs, was to say that the core problem was a lack of sufficient resources and that more money was needed for education. Some of their advocacy campaigns use newspapers and television to show photographs of schools in really bad condition. And this embarrassed politicians in the home countries and made kind of well-wishing people in the donor countries feel bad. And as a result, billions of dollars were spent to make schools look better. So in addition to enrollment, the next most important measure of success became new classrooms. It became very popular for kids and parents and politicians and donors to have their picture taken next to the nice new classroom.
Yeah, I have seen a lot of those pictures of nice new classrooms. But as a result, did the children go to school more often and did they learn more?
So Ruth, in asking that question, I think you're really putting your finger on the core challenge. You see, most people assumed that things were better because the schools looked better. There were more classrooms, there were more desks, there were even some more books. And we could definitely report that more money was being spent and more kids were being enrolled. You see, what all of us were doing then is we were assuming that more schooling equals more learning. That the way you make sure children learn is by just sending them to school. But the truth is, we didn't really know. The enrollment measure that we all focused on, when it came down to it, all it told you was whether your child's name was written on a list at the beginning of the year. That's what enrollment means. It didn't tell you whether the kids were actually attending school regularly, let alone tell you whether kids were learning. Now, you see, what at this time was also happening is that there were a set of studies from countries around the world which were showing that billions of dollars that were being spent on improving infrastructure often did not translate into better learning outcomes. In other words, more schooling was not leading to more learning. We also saw at the same time studies that showed that teachers with credentials, such as teachers who had degrees, bachelor's degrees, master's degrees, were not necessarily better teachers than those who did not have degrees. Better classrooms did not lead to more learning, and ensuring that teachers had degrees and better credentials also didn't seem to lead to more learning. In our own experience in East Africa, as we were observing what was going on, seemed to kind of confirm what these studies were showing, was giving us that uneasy feeling that despite these huge investments, children were not doing well, that schooling had become a kind of a charade where the teachers and the kids were going through the motions, pretending to do education. But it wasn't real. And the most frustrating thing was that these concerns were being drowned out by the big enrollment numbers and the shiny new schools, and the donors and governments and frankly even people, parents and kids, were congratulating themselves for the progress that was being made. And no one seemed to be interested in looking at the problem.
So why do you think you weren't able to get attention? What do you think the core problem was?
We came to realize two things. First, that all the focus on improving education was about inputs, like what you put in to improve education. So things like money, classrooms, books, teachers with qualifications. It wasn't about outcomes. How are children better off at the end of it? Imagine you have a bread factory. It's as if we were focused on how much flour and salt and water was going into it, but we were not looking at the quality of the bread, whether the bread was edible, healthy, and tasted good. So we realized what we needed to do is to change the focus of policymakers as well as the public from focusing on schooling inputs and instead to focus on learning outcomes. The second thing we realized is if we're going to do this, we better come up with a good measure for measuring those learning outcomes.
Okay, Rakesh, so what exactly did you do about this?
Educationalists all around the world agreed that the most important foundation for lifelong learning is basic literacy and numeracy, the ability to be able to read and count, which you usually should achieve by third grade or around when you are 9 years old. That's the level we focused on. We figured that if that's what you can get right, then you have the foundation. Fortunately, there was a group in India that had figured out a really interesting methodology to actually measure whether children are learning. What they did was they used volunteers to use these very simple tests to measure whether children could read and whether they could count. And it was fantastic because it was a very simple way of doing this. You could train people over a day or two to know how to use this, and they fanned out across the country to people's homes and they measured the ability of children aged between 7 and 16 to see whether they could actually read and whether they could actually count. And we adopted this methodology in East Africa. And what is really important about this approach is that it's repeated every year. So it keeps the information fresh and it gives you new data every year. And what this allowed us to do was not to just give opinions, but to give actual data, actual evidence about whether children could read and count. And it was done in a rigorous, systematic way across the whole part of the country so that it couldn't just be dismissed that it's only happening in a few places. And once this evidence was gathered, the amazing part of it was that it was shared in the community. So people who are involved in the testing knew what was going on. And for many of them, it also opened their eyes. They realized that their children had been going to school but were not able to read. That information was then also shared with authorities across different levels, local and national. And it was made public. It was published and put on websites, and it got a lot of media coverage. So what we were able to do with this approach was to show that even though millions of children were in school, that many of those children were in fact not learning, that they were not able to read and that they were not able to do arithmetic. And the fact that this information was shared at the community level, at the national level, and through media began to change the conversation from inputs to outcomes and began to change our focus from how shiny are the classrooms and how many books did we have to focusing on the children and asking the question, are they actually learning?
Rakesh, that was a great example, how one set of organizations thought about a problem and a context and used research and observations to figure out what to do. A theory of change is just another way of saying, given the problem that you want to solve and your understanding of the causes of that problem, what changes do you need to promote or induce? And working backwards from those changes, what activities will you undertake to make those changes happen? Often when you're doing a theory of change with your colleagues, you have to spend quite a bit of time working through it, debating, thinking, drawing information from other sources so that you really get to a place where you can settle on a theory of change that works for your organization. Developing a theory of change is a crucially important and valuable step in building a shared understanding and a clear description of your work that you can share with others.
So now that you've seen an example of how you can identify a problem and the best solution, we'll go over some steps for how you could do this in your own situation. This will help you create a theory of change. Step 1. State the problem.
What problem are you working to solve?
Step 2 is to lay out all the possible causes of the problem.
If there are many, see if you can categorize them in ways that make sense to you. You might remember that earlier we talked about behavioral problems or governance problems. So if those categories make sense, you can use them. If they don't, use other language that makes sense to you and your colleagues. Whenever possible, draw from data and research evidence to identify these causes.
Now that you have the direct causes of the problem, step 3 is to lay out the indirect causes of the problem.
That is, the causes of the problem. And as you might remember from both Rakesh's story and from earlier discussions, for example, of the problem of HIV prevalence, the most immediate problems are often behavioral, that people aren't doing what they should be doing. And then it works backwards to larger, more structural problems that are pervasive in society. And again, draw from data, from research evidence, and from your own knowledge to come up with your understanding of those causes.
In the 4th step, you're going to flip the first 3 steps towards the positive.
So until this point, we've been building a kind of chain of problems. What's the problem? What's caused that? What's caused those causes? So next, what you want to do is state the positive change you want to occur. So if the problem is that children in the early grades are not learning, The positive change you want to occur is that those children consistently learn to grade level so that they can succeed in later years. Next, you want to state the changes in the direct causes that need to occur so that that positive change will happen. At this point, think through and write down any assumptions you've made to draw this link. You'll remember from Rakesh's story that people wanted better education, and they thought the way to get there was by putting more resources into building schools and hiring teachers. So they made a lot of assumptions when they decided that those were the right actions to take.
The fifth step is to lay out all the changes that need to happen within the indirect causes of your problem, so that the direct causes never get a chance to appear.
Think this through and write down any assumptions you've made to draw this link. Basically, you're building a causal chain that leads from the positive change you want to see in the world, say the children learning at grade level, back through the changes that need to occur to make that happen. As you do that, you'll refer back to your understanding of the problems at each level.
At this point, you're ready for step 6, the final step.
State the actions that you and or others could take to induce the changes in those indirect causes. Think it through and write down any assumptions you've made to draw this link. As you can imagine, doing all this work is not easy, and you have to make some guesses along the way. As you make the guesses, that's often where you'll find the key assumptions in your theory of change. You may find it challenging and even frustrating to fit complex problems into a linear and simplistic framework. You might find it helpful, in fact, to break free of the linear approach and draw pictures, connect arrows, try to represent your understanding of how the problems and solutions are connected. The point, though, is to make sure that using reason and evidence, a kind of logical flow, you're connecting through this reverse engineering the problem you're keen to solve to the activities you think need to be undertaken to solve it. This will help you figure out who you need to persuade to do what, and particularly what needs to be done. The most important thing, though, is not to start with the activities themselves, not to start with what you think you want to do. Don't start by listing everything your organization does and then finding ways to draw lines and logical connections to the good things you want to happen in the world, the mission your organization is working on. When you do that, you might miss opportunities to allocate your time and other resources in the most strategic and effective ways. And you commit one of the primary sins of NGOs, which is to think that their business is to stay in business rather than to solve problems. Your aim is to solve important social, political, and environmental problems, and working through a theory of change can help you figure out how to spend your time, money, and energy in the most effective ways. Okay, we've covered a lot of ground here, and it may sound very complicated to prepare a theory of change, going through all these forward steps and backward steps. It will make much more sense to you if you try to do it with a problem that you are working on and in a context that you're working in.
Thanks for tuning in. Next up, join us as Ruth and Rakesh discuss what to look at when designing a successful advocacy strategy.